Let's do this. All right, welcome back. It's Tuesday. We have a few issues lined up today. Hopefully we get through all of them. We will find out. Famous last words usually. Let's start with this one here. Noah?
All right. Well, like it says there at the top, yeah, this is basically APIs for users to configure which metrics are on and off and to configure syncs that those metrics get sent to. It was heavily based on what we already do for iLogger for the same sort of thing. So hopefully, like I pretty much just looked there, copied the patterns that I saw there, tried to make mild adjustments as necessary so that it would make sense for metrics instead of logs. And then that's what produced the APIs that are listed here. I'm not sure how you want to go through.
Yeah, so I guess the easiest thing is if you just start with sample usage, right? Because there's a lot of APIs.
Yep. So yeah, there's a bunch of different examples here. And so Chris Ross is the one who's actually been doing all of the implementation and like all of the day-to-day work. I was just sort of the one who assisted with the initial design. And Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, what's done so far is just the API portion and not the config portion, and config is coming back later. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, we front-loaded the API-based config. But the PR I have out right now has created the assemblies and added all the APIs relevant to configuration. They're just not implemented.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, so a bunch of these examples. There are examples of how you do it, in like the JSON configuration, and then there's also going to be an example of how you would do it, programmatically using the API, and it should mostly be one-to-one relationships between the configs and the APIs.
So the add OpenTelemetry thing already exists, right? That's not new, is it?
Sorry, what was that?
The sample code here that already exists today, right? That's not part of the API proposal, right?
No, this is that is new.
The metrics property itself is new.
Yes. So if you see here,
gotcha. All right.
Yep. And that add open telemetry, that's also a hypothetical extension method that the open telemetry team would create once metrics exists for them to hang it off of.
I see.
Like open telemetry does already have their own API that doesn't rely on this new metrics API for them to configure meters. The difference is just that all of that configuration is using a API explicitly defined by OpenTelemetry, and you wouldn't be able to use that API if you were using anything else except for OpenTelemetry. So like if you were switching from OpenTelemetry to Prometheus.net, you would have to abandon their API and use something else.
Is their API also config based? Or supporting config?
OpenTelemetry's API?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they can do everything that this one does via config, but there are some things that they can do via config.
Okay. So it's basically an example like why we provide the properties, so they basically have something to key things off of.
yeah, so I mean, so that add open telemetry is an example of adding a sink. So, you know, that the metrics just provides sort of a routing point to hook the API on in the same way that logging does. Like that shape looks very similar.
Right.
And then of course other parts of the API is to configure which metrics are on and off. So that, you know, this one is showing a mixture of both. It's using an API to register a sink, and it's using the configuration to determine which metrics are on and off. Or specifically, it's using JSON configuration as opposed to like programmatic configuration.
That makes sense.
And then and then, you know, there's many other examples here if you just want to see, you know. So, you know, there you can see on the builder.metrics, instead of add open telemetry, we called add Prometheus, a hypothetical extension method that a different library would add to register itself as a sink.
Okay.
And so now, you know, now we're showing sort of examples that configure which metrics are on and off. So these are hypothetical examples where open telemetry would register their own metrics that are created in instrumentation libraries that they own. And so those, you know, add runtime metrics, add ASP.NET Core metrics, those are things that, again, are sort of hypothetical extension methods that they would create once this feature existed. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we should find examples of so there's an example of sort of turning some metrics on and off using config, and there's basically a similar example of turning metrics on and off using the enable metrics API instead.
So it's a bit unusual the way you propose it here, but I guess it makes sense. You're basically starting with just hypothetical APIs to just illustrate what the high-level user experience would be for the APIs you're proposing here, which you think of generally as plumbing, right? So you don't expect users to actually call these, because these are the actual plumbing APIs that you know you could call directly, but you would expect effectively libraries like OpenTelemetry or Prometheus to effectively use those as plumbing, and then they provide some more high-level extension methods somewhere so that it's not just a bunch of strings.
I'm actually foreseeing potentially both. Like I think for logging, many of our examples do look like, so for logging, it's called add filter instead of enable metrics, but it does just take strings that represent prefixes of iLogger categories. I mean, it could be exactly the category, or it could be a prefix of the category.
Mm-hmm.
And that is explicitly what we show to users is like, call this API and put this string here, and that will determine which categories are on and off.
Right.
And then it is possible for libraries to create strongly typed wrapper functions on top of that, so that instead of putting a string, you would call, you know, enable whatever logging, and it would put the right strings in the implementation.
Right.
But I don't actually know how common that is for libraries to create those strongly typed wrappers. I think in many cases, you know, users just they just write the function specifying the string.
Or we give a sample or template that provides the config. That's what we do for logging.
Right. So yeah, or the sort of the upper example where it's still the string, but the string is in JSON configuration and not in an API call. And then whether or not the user writes that string into their config directly, or we provided a template that includes the string, is again kind of the two possible options of, did the user do it, or did we sort of do something on their behalf?
So one thing that's kind of interesting about the strongly typed methods at the top there is that we could provide those for runtime in ASP.NET Core, and then those would be generic across providers. They wouldn't be OpenTelemetry specific.
I mean, yes, we could. I
don't know
haven't necessarily proposed doing it. My assumption again was we would probably just stick default strings into a template, but I mean, mostly just because that's the pattern that logging already took. Like, we didn't define strongly typed APIs when we did it for logging, and a lot of this has just been do the same thing we did for logging to try and give people the benefit of that precedent.
Yeah, I was more trying to distinguish the fact that those strongly typed extensions are actually pretty much unrelated to the sync that you're using.
Yes, I mean, something needs to define it. Presumably, presumably it would be a component that defined the instrumentation itself.
So are all metrics providers, so the sources, are they all disabled by default?
Yes.
Okay.
I
thought it worked, but
that is
matches the code.
Slightly, well, I mean, because logging has a concept of levels, logging, if you specify nothing, there's a default level, like I think it's either warning or information that is enabled by default. But since there is, I mean, metrics are just on or off, so whatever you can either pick on as the default level or off as the default level, but you don't have some middle ground where some of them, they can say which level they operate at and then turn on some in the middle option by default. So all of them are off by default is just what I picked.
And then when they're off, that means that it's not that the sync is told not to listen to them, or rather hasn't been told to listen to them yet. They're actually not even issuing data.
Correct. There's no, I mean, yeah.
So with the code that Emo has on screen, so at builder.metrics.enablemetrics.
Yep.
So now if the next call to enable metrics itself does things for Microsoft Extensions caching, is caching now already doing things? Because you're talking about a builder pattern and a global state, and so I'm curious when global state is actually being modified here.
These extensions do not modify global state at all. These are purely DI-driven syncs that don't do anything until the builder actually starts. Until the web application calls start.
Okay. So nothing in the configuration pipeline itself is allowed to produce, or nothing before builder.build it can itself produce metrics.
Correct.
Yeah, at least not if you're using this mechanism to try and listen to them.
Right. And this is, I guess, doing just the sliced / scoped whatever versions that were the last couple of rounds of API review for metrics. where they're isolated to a container environment.
It actually does both the, well, I can't remember if we have explicit examples, but by default, it's actually doing both the isolated and the non-isolated one, but there are specific overloads where you can be more detailed as to whether you want to resolve these names sort of locally in the container scope or globally in the application scope.
So the code on screen when you eventually call build will change global state, not DI container scope state.
It will.
No.
I mean, wait.
It will
one second.
subscribe to
Jose
global state.
has his hand up, but I will go ahead, Jose, and then I'll answer Jeremy's question.
Go ahead and answer, and I can ask my question later. It's a separate, so I'm interested.
Oh, okay. So there, basically, within the DI container, you have this list of sinks that are receiving data for these metrics, and you have a list of sinks, and you have a list of what metrics are being listened to. Good so far?
Yes.
Okay. So that list of what metrics are being listened to could include metrics that were registered using the Meter Factory API. And it could also include metrics that were just registered using new meter.
Okay.
So we have the option
the
of subscribing to global meters,
Yeah.
but only after the host is started.
Right,
Can we
but
scroll up to the actual thing where there's like enable global metrics, enable local metrics?
But
and all
when
that
that-
kind of stuff?
I mean, that hasn't shown up yet. I think
okay.
if you want to see it, you have to scroll down instead of up.
But my recollection is there are stateful instruments that, unless they're enabled, don't actually wake up their state. So if Microsoft
So-
Extensions caching has any of these stateful instruments, are they in the active or deactive state for the
So it
non-scoped
so-
pipeline?
So as soon as one listener exists, and this thing here would count as a listener, then they would enter the active state.
Because they're subscribed to, or everything turns on at that time?
I mean, if you subscribe to them, then they would be in the active state. So
Okay, but based on what's on here, no state. If this is the entirety of metrics enablement, then nothing in system.net that has stateful metrics would be woken up by that. Like they would still be running on their faster. No, I don't need to go down this path and manage state code paths.
Yes.
So
Okay.
Wait, so in that which are we looking at, the config example or the programmatic one? Because they actually have a different, like the examples are slightly different.
Yeah, but neither of them say system.net. So
They say system though.
They
It's a
say so.
prefix.
So these are prefixes. It applies to anything with that prefix. So in the first example on the screen, the config one, where it says system:true, that's turning on everything that starts with prefix of system, which includes system.net.
fair enough. So for the code
So-
version,
Okay. So in the code version, which doesn't say that, then no, like the system.net metrics would not be on yet.
Okay.
And if some piece of code said, new meter system.net, and then meter.createCounter and counter do something, that would be disabled. It would be running through a fast path where there are no listeners and no data gets transmitted anywhere.
okay. I think for the next 30 seconds, I'll understand how this works.
So mine is probably kind of a dumb question, Noah, but what happens if some user tries to use both approaches? So they have the config approach and the value that they set in one contradicts the other. So for example, the config approach says system :false, and then they also use the builder approach, and that one is enabling system as well. Is that like an anti-pattern that will have an analyzer detecting or something like that? Or
I mean, I probably wouldn't recommend they do it just because it's confusing, but it's effectively the same thing as, so for each one of these enable metrics calls, there's also a disable metrics call. So effectively you're turning it on and then you're turning it off again. And we would define which order they occur in, but that's probably subtle, and I would encourage people to depend on, which one happens first and which one happens later. But
Right.
I mean,
Okay,
I
I have to go, unfortunately.
But wouldn't it be
Attempted.
desirable to say config overrides whatever is in code? Just because
Yeah,
that's
that's
kind
just
of
a
the way.
policy decision we need to make.
Yeah.
So we'd probably just say all of the programmatic options sort of run first, and then we apply the config options, so that if you have written it one way in code and a different way in config, the config one will wind
We
up
often do the
taking
opposite
precedence.
because of debugging. Like, it's like people want to have what they put in program main work. And like, if you don't want the code to override stuff, just don't write the code and just use config. You can't do an analyzer for that, unfortunately, because like you don't know if because it's implicit, right? Like we're just loading config all the time, like with web application builder, and so we don't know, like maybe there will be config, maybe there won't. But what's the default meter scope? Is it global or local?
It's both.
Okay.
We just search both for a name.
I see. So global does not imply local, and that's why it's flags. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, my gut would be code wins out over config because code's code. But I guess I can also see the other.
For that, like, the argument would be mainly if you want to do a no deployment change, right? Like if there's something going wrong, it's in the middle of the deployment, and you wanna change just the config. That's much easier. You don't have to restart the application.
Right.
So I could definitely see that.
At that point, you wouldn't use code at all.
I can see that. I think the point is just, you define an order, right? And you want to have it consistent with what we have done in the past, I guess.
Right.
We should double check logging. When I know Kestrel is code first, I mean, code is priority.
Which basically means it loads config and then executes code, and so code gets the final say.
Right.
So I would basically just pattern our behavior on whatever logging does. So in the same way with logging, where you could have both a filter in config and a filter in code, whatever one takes priority there, I would have the same one take priority here.
So I'm struggling a bit with like, okay, how do we want to review the APIs? Because there's a lot of APIs all over the place. Like and they're not, the examples that you have here are not really mirroring the APIs. So I'm a bit at loss with like what APIs I want to look at first. We can just go top to bottom. But since the samples don't really connect to the APIs, I'm not entirely sure how you want to do that.
I mean, I'm happy to go top to bottom, and we can just explain things as we go.
I think that might be the easiest. So what do these do?
So those are the two different entry points into the feature. This is the equivalent of the add logging API for configuring logging. The first one, the first overload is just if you have absolutely no configuration to be done. So the first one is basically just a carryover from earlier, where it creates the factory, but without any configuration, nothing is going to be on. So you can call that if you want to make sure that a factory will exist in the container, but it doesn't do any configuration. And then the second one, has that action on the metrics builder, which is if you want to do some configuration.
Is it intentional that you create a new type? Because there's an existing one called metrics service extensions that already has an add metrics method on it.
I think I renamed it for clarity.
Okay, so there would only be one type that just has two extension methods. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, personally, I don't care what the name is, because if you look at the namespace, it's all over the place already. So whatever feels good.
But if there's already an add metrics extension method, then this will collide.
No.
No.
I think he says he renamed the type.
The add metrics was added in a previous preview.
Right.
And so we're just, this is adding one more overload, not two.
Yep. And the type was renamed from metric service extensions to metric service collection extensions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand now.
That's just a standard pattern that we use elsewhere for extension method classes.
So then what's new here is basically the delegate that takes the metrics builder, right?
Yes.
Was add metrics previously API reviewed?
I believe so.
It was as part of the meter factory feature.
Okay.
That's
Just
where
checking.
it came from.
Configure is a weird name for that parameter.
I think they're all named like this though, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the general pattern is weird, I would argue, but it is what it is.
Microsoft extensions.
Yeah, pretty much.
Totally different rule book.
All right.
And then presumably I guess I'm scrolling down now. So presumably we are happy with the builder being an interface again.
It's fine. It's mostly just a marker for an anchor for extension methods. It doesn't really do anything.
Yeah.
Well, right now it basically exposes the services thing, right? So I guess the question is, would you ever foresee anything else being there? If the answer is no, then I guess that works.
I don't foresee anything else being there. I can't come up with anything.
And I guess the thing that we define an interface that has a services property rather than just taking an add service collection is only to give a different entry point for extension methods?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And that way you can have that property on various things like the host builder that is hostbuilder.metrics for all your extensions. That's much later in this doc.
Oh, so the metrics property is of type iMetrics builder?
Mm-hmm.
I see. Okay, that makes sense now.
So then these metric builder, the next little set of 3 methods on metrics builder extensions. So these are just the 2 add listeners are for registering syncs, and the clear listeners is to remove all of the syncs that you've added thus far.
Mm-hmm.
The expectation for the first 2 is you probably wouldn't call them directly. They would probably be plumbing. Mm-hmm. Someone like a third-party library would create their own extension method with their own, put their own object in there for the metrics listener or for the strong type of the listener.
Like the add open telemetry call that you had earlier, right? Yeah.
Right. So as the user, you would call add open telemetry, add Prometheus, add whatever APIs provided by those, and they would use these add overloads here as their implementation detail to actually put their listener into the list.
And we have an example for that with add debug console.
and then
And you use the
then
term
clear-
listener because you expect other things to be added at some point. Because you could just have add and clear, but you went with add listener and clear listeners.
Well, no, these are extension methods on iMetrics Builder, and there's going to be a bunch of rules added to Metrics Builder as well.
I see.
I mean, there's also just like other people defining their own strongly typed things, and a lot of those things are likely to have the word add at the beginning.
Sure.
Like, we had add open telemetry, add Prometheus,
Gotcha, yeah.
add different kinds of metrics.
If you just briefly scroll down, we'll also have a whole bunch of things like enable metrics. There you go. That are off the same type.
Why do we put them on different types? Why don't we just have them all on one type?
You mean the static class?
Yeah.
Organization?
Yeah, just keep in mind, I mean, like, this is the problem that I have with the extension namespace, is that basically good luck trying to find anything in there. Because there's a lot of like types that are just basically placeholders for extensions. So for someone trying to get basically an overview, they're basically screwed. That's the big problem with extension methods. I mean, we already have this problem, but it feels like I would not artificially increase the number of types we have, because that seems like just a recipe for making it even harder to understand what's going on. But yeah, I don't have strong opinions because it's kind of like already a mess. So that's what type of two type probably makes no difference.
I mean, I guess. So again, the fact that these are two different types was just something that it copied directly from what logging was doing.
Sure.
So I guess you tell me the preference. Is the preference to merge types and break with the precedent, or should the preference be to preserve the precedent that logging established?
Those are the pro
I'm
and
not
cons.
convinced
Yes,
it's going to matter that much for users.
I agree. Like it's
users will never see this type. The only place you'll see this type is if you're directly browsing the source control, trying to find a particular extension method.
The general guideline these days is extension methods should be designed to also look good as a static call, but Microsoft extensions is a different rulebook.
Heard that one. Blanche?
Hey guys, so I implemented this in Open Telemetry. So mainly iMeter Listener and these extensions. I'm just noticing here, Noah, there's this interface, iMetrics Subscription Manager. I didn't need to touch that at all, so I'm just curious, what's the use case for that interface?
We'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
Let's go back up and reset to... Yeah, but that's purely for infrastructure purposes. Yeah, do we want to go back up to the prior class and make sure we didn't skip over anything?
So did we decide to merge the types or keep it separate as log?
I mean,
doesn't matter, does it?
Well, I have no preference, but if Emo or Jeremy, if they, I mean, those are basically the two options. Would be follow the precedent that logging set, in which case they're two separate types, or break from precedent and merge them. And I don't care, because I very much don't expect users to be poking around on those types directly. But if you guys have a preference for which one it should be, or if anybody in the group has a preference.
Tarek?
Yeah, I prefer just merge the types. I mean, I don't see strong reason like to keep separate types doing the same, extensions on it. I mean, yeah.
I have one preference, which is just about organization, where like that second section is a lot of extensions that all do similar things, and they have several private helper methods and all those things. But that could also be done with partial classes, just splitting the file up. So take your pick.
Yeah, just have one type, including everything. Like,
So-
one place to look at.
So one vote to merge it, and no other votes for anything, I guess.
Yeah, my
You
statement
know,
was
Jeremy-
mostly a question. I think to me it's kind of like I understand the argument that it doesn't really make a difference given where we are today. So I can live with the way you have it right now.
If we merge it, is there a preference of what the merge type gets called?
Something metrics, something extensions.
Metrics builder extensions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say, like, for me, the big problem with reviewing these things is because of the way this whole thing works, it feels always very indirect, right? You basically have to merge it in your head anyways. So that's why I'm asking. It's like the only way to use these APIs are looking at sample code, because if you just try to make sense of the big building blocks, it's actually all over the place. Or at least that's what it presents itself, right? But with the way it's constructed. But that's, again, a general outcome of the way we do these types.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly different surface areas being exposed for different purposes within the samples.
Yep.
I wouldn't expect a user to encounter it this way. For example, we wouldn't just be like, here's a pile of APIs, use it. We would have some docs that probably guide them through the bits that they would be using.
Yeah, this is pretty low level infrastructure.
But we're good with the add listener over the add listener method, the clear listeners, and we should move on to the next set of them.
I assume clear is meant mostly for debugging, right?
Logging, actually, it's pretty common for people to say, clear out any defaults that the system added. I'm just going to use this one. Because the hosts add several by default, and that kind of annoys people.
Gotcha.
I'm not expecting hosts to add any defaults for metrics.
Famous last
So
words.
I mean, it's possible, but I'm not currently expecting them to add a default for metrics. But the clear is still there, again, just following the pattern for logging. Right. My hunch is if no one is setting defaults, then there would be far less usage of clear listeners, but it's there and someone could use it in exactly the same way.
And clear is just a shorthand for some crazy DI container shenanigans. All right. Metrics source?
Yeah, it's probably useful to do metrics listener and metrics source together. So iMetrics listener, this is the interface that you implement as a third party if you want to have a sync that listens to metrics. And you can see in the second method there on iMetrics listener, there's a call to set source. So basically the runtime will call that method on your listener to sort of tell you this is the source that your metrics are coming from. So now as a listener, you have a reference to the source where the metrics are coming from, and you can call methods on that source. And there's only one method you can call there. So there, with metrics, there's basically metrics that are push-based and metrics that are pull-based. The push-based ones, you just, as a listener, you just get callbacks at arbitrary times and you're expected to deal with it. For the pull-based ones, that's where you would call source.record observable instruments. And that is you saying, I want to pull the values of all those metrics right now. And you can, and as a listener, it's your prerogative to decide how frequently you pull.
So
you know,
and if I call this method, what happens? I just basically get push-based notifications for those?
Yep.
So basically that translates the pull into push.
Yeah. Yep.
It triggers a one-time push.
Right.
For the set of metrics that are pull-based.
So, yeah, no.
Yep.
iMetric listener can be used to listen for multiple instruments in the same time, or we expect like to have just one object per instrument to listen to?
It listens to potentially and likely many instruments simultaneously.
And if we are listening to multiple of them, so set source is going to be called like multiple times for different instruments at the time, or what?
No, there's just one source ever. And I mean, and the only thing that you can do with the source is you just say, I want to pull all of the pull-based instruments at this time. That's the only operation on there.
Okay.
And implementation-wise, the source is just a private class that I've implemented that does the rules mapping that says, okay, these rules say these instruments should be enabled on those listeners. And so it has a reference to all the rules, all the instruments, all the listeners. And so it knows which ones to trigger.
Okay, so going back to metrics listener, I'll just walk them down. So name is just a name of your metrics listener, and I believe the only usage of that is so that you can refer to it in config. Is that right, Chris?
Config and rules.
Okay.
Rules can specify particular
right.
listeners.
Right. So that just sets a name for your listener. Set source is something that the runtime calls on each listener as it's being, constructed to allow you to save a reference to the source. Instrument published is a notification that the runtime calls anytime that there is a new instrument that it's about to start notifying you of, and the Boolean return value is basically you as a listener saying whether or not you want to listen to that instrument. And the user state out parameter is also you as the listener saying that you want to attach some state to this instrument that will be given back to you every time a measurement occurs.
And instrument published is only called if there is a rule mapping between the instrument and the listener.
Basically,
if you've marked the instrument as enabled for some or for this listener or for all listeners.
If you've turned it on. The measurements completed is a callback like from the runtime to the listener when we're done sending measurements for that instrument and no more measurements will occur. And then the get measurement handler is again called by the runtime, and it says, give me back the delegate. And that measurement callback, that's the delegate that will be invoked every time a measurement happens. And so that's the set of, that's the listener and the source together.
Blanche had some questions about the callback, the generics. Also, there are some issues flowing that state into the callback that we'll probably need to talk about later, Noah.
Okay.
Blanche?
Sure. So we're talking about that last method on iMetrics listener, get measurement handler. So it implements that generic T. What happens in the code today is the calling thing loops over its defined supported T's and calls that method. So I implemented this method in OpenTelemetry. I didn't know what was going to be called, so I just set a breakpoint and, just captured all the invocations. So runtime called my listener for byte, int, float, double, decimal, short, and long.
Right.
Turns out OpenTelemetry doesn't support decimal, so I had to figure out what to do. You have to return a callback. What I wanted to do was return, like, I don't support this type, so I didn't know how to do that. Do I throw? Do I return a no-op? So I kind of recommended making the return nullable, but we could also just drop the generic and just return like a class or a struct with, here's the 5 callbacks that I can set. Maybe I don't set some of them, but like a tighter contract. The generic type here feels kind of weird because we don't support all types. You can't define your own type. There's a limited set supported, if that makes sense.
So, yeah, I mean, I think sort of the straightforward alternative would just be to have whatever, n different methods here that's like, handle int measurement, handle double measurement, handle short measurement, like just iterate that for every type that we plan on having, and then you as the implementer of iMetrics listener would implement all of them.
Would that list ever change? Seems like it might.
It can grow, yes.
So that's not something we would want to put on the interface directly.
I don't know that we would ever grow it. I mean, didn't we? I thought we had a very specific set that we defined for meter listener, and this is that same set.
I mean, you never knows about, like, today we decided not to support uint, for example. I mean, and I know that the reasons behind that, but in the future, for example, about like if we got some scenarios that makes sense uint to be supported there. I mean, so we are going to have this. So I understand, like, unlikely, maybe we are not going to grow it, but it's possible to grow.
Okay. If we grew it, would we just use a default interface method, and the default interface method would have no implementation inside of it? Effectively, anyone.
DIMs aren't supported in many of the TFMs for this type, for this package.
Okay.
Though there was a prior suggestion that this return a struct containing all the possible callbacks, and that the struct is something you could extend, right?
Yes.
And we make the set of callbacks nullable. Like each one would be or never mind, I guess there's no, sorry, the delegate itself could always be null.
Right, the individual parameter properties on the struct, you mean?
Right, yeah.
So that was the other question was, it's kind of weird that you would have callbacks that the listener doesn't support, and you just be dropping metrics into the void.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the flip side. If we ever add to our list of types, and we already have sinks that exist that only support certain types, then we have just created the combination where everything new that we added would be dropped into the void for everything that was pre-existing. I mean, unless, I guess you could make something that like automatically mapped from the new type to an old one.
And that isn't necessarily a new thing because we have the existing API meter listener, where in this case, runtime calls this method to sort of retrieve all the callbacks. For meter listener, the code calls into meter listener and feeds it the delegates. So we already have that problem where if you don't make that call to meter listener, it's just going to have null or no op delegates and drop some set of its metrics today.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, in any case, I'm totally fine if we want a struct of delegates instead of this function that, has the generic parameter on it.
Sure.
I don't.
It's a lot more discoverable about what you're supposed to be populating.
Any other feedback on any of this? Are folks just sort of like nodding along?
I did find set source kind of weird. So this is coming from somebody who works on open telemetry and understands like observable. I had to go read the code to figure out what that was and what to do with it. Just the name metric source kind of, it invokes like activity source. We have the factory.
Right.
I don't know, I found it a little confusing. So maybe if we make it more explicit to observable source or poll source or something of that nature, it might be a little bit less confusing, but
okay.
The amount of people implementing this will be very, very small. It'll be like open telemetry and Prometheus. So
right.
It's not the end of the world.
I'm perfectly open to adjusting the name of that thing if you think, if you want to like observable metric source. Does that?
Yeah, I mean it's one-to-one for observable today. So maybe if it just had observable in the name to kind of indicate, okay, for your observable instruments, which you have to invoke their collection, you use this other interface thing. Where metric source is kind of generic. It felt like, okay, is this a meter? Is this all metrics? Sure. If that makes sense.
Yep. I'm happy to stick the word observable in it.
I mean, it's generally an awkward pattern because you don't know when it's being called, right?
Sorry,
yeah, it kind of raises the question, like if it's called multiple times, what do I do?
Right.
Do I drop the first one? Does it override? Yeah. Should I support multiple? It's a little bit of an odd API.
I mean, I would assume, given that it's named set source, not add source, that it's last one wins, right?
Yep.
Yes, though it should only be called once.
Right. I mean, it's another way you can do it. Is like call it initialize, right? I don't know what else. It's a.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, you could, instead of being called set source, it could just be called init. If that makes it clearer. Or initialize or whatever.
Yeah, I guess my question is generally when is that being called? I assume when you add the listener somewhere.
Yeah, I mean it's basically being, when the listener gets added to the list of listeners, or we call this method once on each listener to say, okay, you've now been registered as a listener. Here's the reference to the source that you're going to need to pull the observable metrics.
Right.
So, I mean, ideal, in an ideal world, maybe that would, would just be like part of a constructor, but the main challenge there is it needs to be
on the user type.
We need a unique one for each listener, not a shared one that they're all referencing.
Yeah, also true.
When a listener calls it, it pushes the metrics back to that listener. It doesn't push it to all listeners.
Right.
I mean, unless we do make it a global thing, put it in the DI container and pass in a metrics listener to the method.
Oh,
record observable instruments for listener foo.
It's certainly doable. I mean, I guess you're sort of relying on people not to do funky things and like push metrics to listeners that weren't prepared to receive them.
But they'd have to have a concrete reference to that listener, which they probably wouldn't.
So I'm
fine
with it. I don't know if other people care.
So why we don't just have like record observable instruments on the listener itself?
Because
the polarity's backwards.
The runtime is the thing that needs to implement record observable instruments. Like the listener doesn't know how to implement record observable instruments. They don't know what observable instruments exist and how to record them.
Right.
And the listener is the one that decides when.
Right. It's a call from the listener to the runtime, not a call from the runtime to the listener.
Right. So, for example, in the console sync, I set a 1 second timer to call back into the source saying, give me your observable instruments every second.
Yeah, if you have the listener, you can do that directly on the listener, right?
What? No. The listener is the one that owns that timer and that decision of when do I want the observable metrics.
I mean, that's kind of an outcome of this being interfaces, right? Like if iMetrics listener, it would be an abstract class. You could imagine that set source is something that is just a public method that we provide the implementation for, in which case record observable instruments could just be a method on the listener that just delegates to the underlying thing, right?
Right.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's kind of doable, right? But like in the end of the day, yes, the user is expected to decide when to pull, right?
Oh, that would be interesting because then the metrics listener is calling record observable on itself.
Well, it's just where you put the code, right? I mean.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's just if you put it on the listener, it should probably be a protected method, would be my guess, right? Because you would expect the listener to call it.
Right.
It's part of its implementation somewhere, but yeah. Other than that, I think that would be a reasonable thing to do. I think in general, like I think that the trouble that I have with this is like there's a lot of moving pieces here, and like I have a hard time like connecting like who is providing what and what am I supposed to do with that. Like, for example, like I understand listener is supposed to call it, but like, how do I do that? Like, do I create a timer in myself and then just do that? Or like, what is the thing that triggers me to call record observable instruments, right?
Yep. I would expect most listeners will have some sort of timer running. And every time that timer ticks, they will call record observable instruments.
But they would also be able to be in control to pause and resume or
control the period of the timer and anything they want.
Right.
Or even kick it based on some external event like hey, look, we just got a new one. Let's just dump everything.
Right.
I would expect the most common is you just create a timer that ticks at regular intervals, and that's what you would do. All right. Should we do the rules?
Really briefly, I put in something in the chat for the new signature for get measurements handler.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused. What am I supposed to do with these messages? Let me just copy this to actually make it readable.
The second one was probably better. So get measurement handlers returns a measurement handlers struct that has a measurement callback of int for the int handler and etc. for each type that we support.
Yeah, and since there are more than 3 reference fields in it, it should be a class.
Okay.
So get measurement handlers should not return a measurement callback, but it should return some new type that has properties.
It returns all of the callbacks in one blob.
Okay, let me write this down somewhere.
All right.
So just instead of being recalled repeatedly with different generic type parameters, now the suggestion is call it once and return a struct, and the struct has, or return a class. The class has properties that one property per handler.
I guess those are nullable, so like this.
Yeah. I mean, you could also do it the other way around, right? You could also just say you have different get measurement handler methods and then have the listener just blow up for types that don't implement, right?
Right, but because it's an interface, then you can't add them, which was a problem that we talked about a few minutes ago.
Oh, you're saying DIMs are not an option because you want to support net standard too?
Yeah. The package currently does.
Gotcha. Yeah.
The class is extensible.
What
It's
is
more extensible than the interface.
What is the failure point then? We just say there is none. You just accept the fact that you just get never called. Potentially.
If you can't provide a callback, then yeah, you're not going to get called for that type of instrument.
I mean, the only downside of that design is basically you ship a type right now that only has a single property called int callback, and we might never actually add new ones because it's going to be a pain in the butt, right?
Oh no, I mean we already have 8.
8.
Yeah. Int, double, float,
7.
something.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And what is the current expectation? Like things that are float will also support int?
I mean, the recommendation that we would make to every listener is that they should support all 8 of these things. Like that there could be metrics that they're going to want to listen to that would involve all 8 of these types, and so they should implement all 8 handlers.
And then basically the implementation is responsible for the type coercion, like rounding to whatever degree they see fit and truncating.
Formatting as needed, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of up to the listener whether they want to provide, specific pathways for each type, and like preserve all of the, the precision of that type, or a simple option that any listener could do is they could just coerce everything into, double.
So then right now the pattern is you do support multiple times. It's just by convention what T's you're kind of handling, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the T's are kind of blind right now, which is awkward.
I mean, if we left it how it was, we would certainly document the list the same. I mean, it's exactly the same list that we have for meter listener, where we basically have a documented list of this is the set of 8 types that we expect you to support here. And it's the same, it's also the same 8 types where like we have instrument of T and we have a list of like, these are the 8 kinds of T that are legal to specify. If you do anything else, it's an error.
7.
7?
7.
7. Okay.
Counting is hard. I mean, I have to say, like, from an API standpoint, it's kind of elegant to just use a generic because it means you don't have to do anything out of the ordinary, but it does have the problem that you have to just document the list, right? But I mean, if we had a wrapper type, could we do something smart there and do the coercion for people already?
Reference type, you mean?
You mean
So
you mean like some type that implements iMetrics listener?
Yeah, so imagine my underlying metric that I actually expose is fundamentally a float, right? I mean, now, like, does it mean anybody who does that has to basically do the, how do I convert my float to a short? How do I convert my float to a long? How do I convert my float to a byte?
Well, hold that thought, because it's the instruments that are type specific, and you're going to be listening to multiple instruments. So you're going to have an instrument that's a long and an int and a double. And so you're going to be receiving all of these.
Well, I thought that a particular metric listener listens to one particular metric, so that would be of some fundamental type, no?
No, a metrics listener represents an output, but it can subscribe to any number of instruments.
Maybe I'm confused then, because you basically have a set source, so I assume there's only one source, so that kind of made it sound like there's only one metric.
The source is more than one instrument. The source is the thing that has the list of all the instruments.
Sorry, I'm confusing metrics and instruments now. So an instrument is the thing that has the number, and then a metric is kind of a collection of those logically then, I guess?
I mean, the way the terminology works is that, you know, an instrument is the thing that collects measurements, and there's, for the sake of this API, there's basically a one-to-one mapping of every instrument produces one metric of like that sequence of measurements over time represents the metric.
I see.
A single listen, like, so open telemetry, for example, would create one instance of the listener, that this is our open telemetry listener.
Right.
And then the runtime would say, like, well, here's 100 instruments that will produce 100 corresponding metrics. And for every one of those 100 instruments, we will call the instrument publish function to say we're announcing the instrument. Then for each one, we will call as needed the get measurement handler, or sorry, we'll call the measurement callback, the delegate that was returned by the handler, to say, you know, this instrument has just recorded a measurement and here it is. And we will call the handler of whatever type we need to based on the type of the instrument. So instruments that are integer typed will call the integer handler, and instruments that are double typed will call the double handler.
Right.
Okay,
but then the source is a single instance of the internal management infrastructure saying that knows which instruments map to which listeners. It's not a particular, it's not an instrument, it's not one of the metric classes. It's just a bookkeeper.
I mean, for the sake of the API, it's just the thing that you call to ask that all of the pullable metrics be pulled. Whether or not we do any other behavior with it behind the scenes is just up to us.
So that means, so there's no coercion then, right? It's basically a given instrument has a type, and you just report, just record basically the data as it comes in.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but
any
like,
coercion could be done internally on your part.
Right.
If we need to pass you a type that you don't really have a good answer for.
Right.
The listener is free to do whatever coercion it wants, but the runtime is not doing any coercion.
Yeah, logically, like if I only subscribe to instruments that are of type in, then the only get measurement handler invocation I ever get is for t being an int, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense now.
But if you subscribe to, well, I say, we're going to call get measurement handler for all the types we support to just precede our list. We're just going to call that once when we create the listener, so that we have all the callbacks we need. And as instruments come and go, we'll call the right callback for the instrument.
Gotcha. So basically, I will get a call for every one of them, and then depending on what instruments I get at runtime, I might call for one of them. But basically, my implementation for get measurement handler has to support all T's on day one.
Yeah. Unless per the suggestion that it could return null for one of them.
Right.
Should we allow that?
I mean, you could. That's the question. What does it mean now when you have an instrument?
Instrument just doesn't work.
Then you drop it on the floor. You decide whether you drop it on the floor, whether you throw an exception and say, hey, sorry, you didn't give me a corresponding measurement callback for that T. I would assume it means drop on the floor. It's like
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, like, I feel like you can go either way. Like, I think given that you call me for every T in the world anyways, I don't even have to have documentation. I can just run my program and see what many T requests I get, right? And just add more if statements to this until my code compiles, right? Or my code runs and doesn't blow up anymore, right? But I'm also okay with saying, we define a type that has all the T's on it, and you're supposed to return that on day one. That's probably a bit more idiomatic.
Okay, let's do that then.
Okay. Class measurement handlers with 7 properties of measurement callback of type X for each type.
Yep.
Okay. Sold. And those are nullable. And if we don't get one, we just don't call it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Now we'll do enable options and enable rule.
Yeah.
So metrics enable options. This thing is just a singleton in the DI container whose purpose is just to store the list of rules about which metrics are on and which ones are off. And then each rule in the list of rules is a instrument enable rule. And then, there's that constructor, and then there's just that, basically this is just sort of plain old data. It's just a list of properties that describe what the rule applies to. So, there's the listener name, you can make rules that apply only to specific listeners, or if it's null, it applies to all listeners. The meter name, and we can discuss whether we should adjust the name of that property. That is either the full meter name or it is a prefix of a meter name. Like anything that starts with that string is enabled.
Yeah, but that's the only one that has partial matches.
Then there's that scopes, which is the little meter scope flag enum just below.
Yep.
So that if the scope of global just says that this thing will match meters that were defined with the new meter constructor, and scope of local means it will match things that were defined using the meter factory.
The way you've presented it, global is the 0-bit, which means it can't actually be specified.
Yeah, you want the 0 for none, and then you want global 1 and then local 2, right? Otherwise, it's going to be funny.
Good call. Yeah. So yes, it should be global is the first bit flag and local is the second bit flag.
That makes sense. So you say enable rule. Are there any other rules? Like, why not just instrument rule?
There are no other rules. So if we wanted to, we could change the name. I think enable was just there to indicate the intent of these rules is to decide whether a instrument is enabled or not. But
and in fact, the Boolean enable didn't used to be there. You could only turn them on, but that's a recent change. So yeah, taking it out of the name seems reasonable.
It just seems slightly awkward. Enable rule. Like, I mean, if you just refer to them as instrument rules, I think that makes more sense to me.
Yeah. I would. This type again is. I mean, this sort of represents the lowest level abstraction, which is unlikely to get used directly, but it is legal to do so. Like you could say, metric enable options dot rules add, and then you construct a rule and you put it in the list.
Which reminds me that we should rename metric enable options to metric rule options.
Okay.
Metrics rule options. Rules options, rule option, whatever.
So which one are you talking about?
The prior options class that we just talked about also has the enable in it. The enable in the name.
Right. Where does this guy get exposed from?
It's just a object in the DI container.
Oh, that's the enable metrics one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just registered by type in the DI container as a singleton in the container.
Well, as an I options of metrics options.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a great. So where do these? Yeah. Sorry. The enable metric options must be somewhere, right? Like, who's exposing that? I still don't know who's exposing it.
It's only through I options. And if you scroll down to all those extension methods for enable rules, they are creating the rules.
No, I get this, but like, where does this come from, right? So the metrics builder is the metrics property on the host builder, right? But where does this guy come from?
That comes from configure options of extensions.options. If you
so basically, I'm supposed to DI import my metrics enable options. Is that what you're saying?
It's wait. We're using I options here, and this is the type that we're putting into I options. And so you don't have to do anything.
So what is it? I do an I option of metrics enable options. I still not.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
So I import effectively metrics enable options directly, except that I wrap it in an I options. I option, I
which
guess.
gives us the ability to reload it.
And we name these types generally XXX options. So
Yes.
so we do I option of XXX options.
Yep. Yeah. Memory cache options, Kestrel server options, etc.
Yeah, then I guess same question. Like, do you have any other options for metrics? Because I mean, at that point, just metrics options seems easier.
Trying to remember. I don't believe so. I was trying to remember if we had something for the factory.
The factory does not currently have anything.
Yeah. So no, there's no other options currently. So we could just make this metrics options.
And if the factory really needed something, it might go with metrics factory options.
Yeah. So that's fine. We could just shorten the name to metrics options.
See, there are meter options somewhere else.
Are there?
Meter options are in system diagnostics metrics, but there's no metrics options.
What was on meter options? I'm just trying to remember what that was.
This is used to create a new meter. It's the name, version, tags.
Sorry, yeah, okay. It's not. It also has the word options in it, but it was just the thing that holds. It's not intended to go in the DI container. It's just a holder of parameters for the constructor.
Yeah, creation options for the meter.
Yeah. Okay, right. Okay, no, there's no overlap. They won't even be in the same context.
All right. Any more thoughts about metric options? If we scroll back up to that.
Sorry, I'm too many windows here.
Yeah. Metric options, instrument rule, meter scope, add a none for meter scope. Which is hilarious because none isn't actually a valid value.
Is that when we typically have a flags enum, do we usually add like a none that is the zero, that's like no bits set? Okay.
Yeah, even if it's not valid, I mean, zeros occur in memory, right? What do you want to see when you see the shit in the debugger, right? I mean, it makes sense to render it as none rather than zero.
It's a valid bit flag. It's not necessarily a useful one, but it's like
yeah.
You could define a rule that doesn't match anything. If you want to define a useless rule, you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to like name every bit, right? But like you clearly want to name at least the 0, 1 because it occurs everywhere usually, right?
Yeah.
And you're free to throw from the constructor that takes it, saying that, 0 as well as any bit that's not the 1 or 2 bit is not valid.
Right.
Okay.
At least the 0 bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so the 0 value or those 2 named bits. Because I don't want to get into a semantic argument of what the smallest bit's name is.
Clearly, there's negative 0.
Is it usually just named none? Is that the canonical name for the flag with no bit set in it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll add a none to meter scope with value 0. And then the only other thought that I had is if there was feedback for knowing that meter name is actually potentially a prefix and not the full meter name. I wasn't sure if there was thoughts of whether we just leave that property name as is or if we change it to something. believe logger just has category name, even though really it's prefix.
I would honestly prefer to not indicate it in the name, because that is the kind of stuff where I can see us changing our minds at some point and say, oh, in the past we only supported fully qualified names, but now we also support prefixes, and then it's just, at that point, you're just broken, right? Because now half the stuff has prefix in the name, the other half is name in the name, and it no longer means anything anyway.
Okay. That's fine. And again, I don't actually imagine users typically invoking this constructor or looking at these properties directly. I expect the overwhelming majority will be to use one of those enable metrics overloads down below that is the quick way of adding rules to the list of rules.
I assume the enable rule is effectively a representation of what config looks like, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Anything else for rules or scopes?
No.
So for rule, we have the property scopes. Is it intentionally to be plural scopes, not scope?
Yes. Flags. Scopes is a flag enum, and it's the default value for enable metrics is going to be global or local. So that you'll allow rules, you'll allow meters from either scope.
So it can be global and local in the same time, right?
Yep.
The default value is 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's solve the or and problem. The default value is 3.
Default value is 3. But while we're on rules, should we just jump down and do the big set of methods at the bottom there in the extensions?
Yeah.
All of these enable metrics extension methods are all just short one-liner shortcuts for constructing an instance of instrument rule and adding it to the list of rules in the options that are hanging off of TI. And the analog for logging is called add filter.
Yeah. It's
So
just a one-to-one with all the different properties.
I may have missed this, but what is the difference between the one that is off the builder versus the one that is off the options?
No difference. Syntax shortcut.
And do we need it on both?
I mean,
like what I don't like about this pattern is it basically means every time we add one, we basically do it in 2 places, right? Which is like, I mean, you could imagine iMetrics builder just has an options property, in which case you just say builder.options.enable metrics or something, right? In that case, it's only one place where you can call it. So I was asking, like, why do we have it in 2 places?
The options property wouldn't be compatible with iOptions.
So I heard what you said. I don't know what it means. What do you mean by not compatible?
We have a metrics builder. We don't have a metrics options instance. We have these all register callbacks against options that are run later.
But isn't metrics enable options just a data holder? Like, what prevents the builder from having that?
What prevents? iOptions creates a new instance of the options type every time it reloads. If there's a change triggered somewhere.
So I guess what I'm asking is, when you call enable metrics on the builder, clearly you do something, right? So what
we register a callback into the options system that runs every time a new options instance is created.
I see. And so when you, okay, so if you now would have a builder that has an options property, you would have to kind of say every time you do something to that type, you would have to, or to that instance, you would have to do whatever you currently do on the other extension method.
Yeah. We'd have to be capturing operations, which we don't really know how to do.
Yeah.
I mean, from the standpoint of, do you need it? I mean, strictly speaking, no, you don't need any of those methods, because all of them are just shortcuts over manually adding new instances to the list of rules. It's just a matter of the shortcuts are convenient and offer a way to have people write succinct code, and we did it for logging and I replicated it for metrics.
And the ones we expect people to call are the first set, enable metrics on the builder.
Right.
The fact that it goes through to a metrics options type is more of an implementation detail.
That we happen to make public because why not?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, as long as we're okay with that, it just means that, you know, if you add another overload, you do it. You have to basically add them in pairs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at least they're on the same type, so they're easy to spot.
Right.
I mean, I don't.
And similarly, that last one actually emphasizes this too. Disable would be a duplicate of every one of these with the same parameters, except it sets the enable bit bool to false.
And why do you think you only have that on the options, not on the builder?
No, I think we do need it on all of them. I just only listed it here because I wanted to ask, do we need all the overloads of disable? Is it going to be used as commonly?
I mean, you could just cheat, add a last parameter to all of them called enable that is defaulted to true. And then it's like you get that for free. But
right. That was actually the first thing that I mentioned to Chris in our discussion. I mean, I do think disable is probably clearer.
Yeah.
I mean,
I would assume it's also more rare, right? Like it's not something that you do that often, right?
Yeah.
I mean, more likely it's you're going to enable a big category and maybe disable one or two specific things.
Right.
I would still be tempted to just put all of them just to be consistent, and other than a little bit of tedium for Chris, but I mean, I bet it takes Chris all of 20
10
minutes to implement every one that's there.
Yeah.
For enabled, why aren't the second through fifth, yeah, I can count, collapsed just into one with default parameters?
I didn't think you liked default parameters.
Default parameters are preferred over overloading, but once you have more than two, once you have two or more of them, and cancellation token makes it weird, then you should also have an overload that has no defaults. That's why I said the second through the fifth.
Gotcha.
I have no preference.
Sure.
If the design guidelines prefer default parameters, we can totally do default parameters.
All right. So you have the shortest and the longest.
Yep.
And then one in between that has defaults.
No, just the shortest and the longest has all the defaults.
The longest does have the defaults.
Yeah.
Got it.
Oh, so it's only the shortest that doesn't have the defaults?
Right, and the reason for this is at least the current UX with default parameters is we've seen in usability studies, somebody opens a thing and then they see all the like comma, square brace, square brace, square brace, and they think that the API is hard to use and get freaked out and look at something else. So we added the guideline of add an overload that has no defaults to just say like, this is the simple version, and then if you want complicated, there's a lot more options. You hit comma, and then now like it's like fine. There's a lot more here. Do whatever you want.
So in that guise,
that makes
so
everything easier.
I would expect actually the second one in the list is probably the most likely one they want to call, which is I want to turn on a particular meter. Like that's the one that showed up in a bunch of the examples above.
Okay, what does the one where you didn't give a meter name do?
Turns on everything. It switches it from off by default to on by default.
So is that the same behavior you get if you pass null for the meter name?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure it was a logical default of T-Cascade.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you think that if you want to say that having the meter name as a formal parameter is the thing that you want to float highest in IntelliSense, then yes, then you would leave that one with no defaults and make the other ones be defaulted. That's a little off, but I can see the argument.
I mean, yeah, we can do whatever, and I'm happy to take the recommendation. I'm just letting you know that I expect the second one in that list to represent 95% of the usage.
Yeah, and since part of our when to have the overloads versus defaults is to make IntelliSense friendly, if you think that specifying a meter name is most likely what they want, then yeah, we need to check. Like basically, you just need to do it and see what the IntelliSense experience is to see if we need the first two and the last one, or just the second one and the last one. Because I don't know if it'll see like, oh, I'm going to show you all the square braces now because you could just put a closed parenthesis because I found a shorter variant. So we just need to see which one's the prettiest option of the two.
I recall it sorting by length in IntelliSense options.
Right. So yeah. So my guess is it will show you have a formal parameter that's required here, and then it'll be like, or if you hit comma, things can get weird, and then it'll add square braces in the. So I think you can get by with just the second one, but somebody should try this.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think basically we would say collapse it to this parameter and the meter name, and then everything, and then the longest one where everything's defaulted. If the UX on that's bad, then add the this parameter only overload as well.
All right.
Did you catch that, Emo?
Yeah, I was about to ask. So you're saying basically do what exactly?
So take the longest version of enable metrics and default everything that's not the this parameter. And then delete all the overloads except builder comma meter name.
Everything but. So why that?
They think that's the intended user target, so that's the one we want to highlight in IntelliSense.
I see. So you would also remove the one that only tags options.
Yes.
Oh. Okay.
Unless it's needed to make, like, if IntelliSense gets wonky because it found you could put closed parenthesis right now and everything would be happy, then put that one back. But if IntelliSense is happy to say meter name is a required parameter that you can pass null to, that's probably a. Yeah. I mean, really, yeah. I mean, unless this is violating another Microsoft Extensions zone guideline, and so then maybe the answer is don't even make that one a defaulted parameter. Maybe it's just a formal parameter, and we get rid of the parameterless version. If somebody wants to enable everything, pass null. But I'll leave that up to you guys.
Fair. Yeah, I will try them and see what happens in DI.
Yeah.
But that means then we go to disable metrics and we do the same thing.
Yes.
Right. So
now
you
there's
would
a
then
lot
have
fewer overloads.
so now you would have the 4 total disable metrics, 2 from the options type and 2 from the builder type.
Great.
Less is more.
All right. And I think the very last thing is that subscription manager type that's sitting there. I don't think there's anything else to cover. And Chris, you
I'll
added
take
this
this one.
subscription manager type, so I don't actually, I mean, I have a hunch, but I don't know explicitly what it's for. So why don't you describe what you added there?
So the trouble we ran into was the type that does all the wire up and registers for all the rules and listeners and all the things had to get activated from DI at some point by hosting, so it would actually start and do its work. And there wasn't an easy way to do that, so we threw this in for hosting to call and say, let's activate metrics so they can work. All it does is resolve it from the container and run it.
So, I mean, maybe this is maybe more feature design than API design. I guess it. Why do we need a public API? I guess is my question.
Cross assembly boundaries. Hosting couldn't activate a private type or an internal type
And
from diagnostics metrics.
So I thought the normal way of doing this is you create like an instance of I-hosted service, and then you put
but
whatever
that requires a
you want
dependency in the other direction, which we can't do. Hosting already depends on diagnostic metrics, and so diagnostic metrics can't depend on hosting to implement a hosted service. There is a hosted service, but it lives in hosting and it calls into this type to activate.
Okay, so we'd have circular dependencies if we tried to do it the normal way. Is that
right? Metrics is too low to do it that way.
okay?
Logging is similar. Logging doesn't reference hosting at all. It's activated and run by hosting.
Logging also has one of these public interface things.
Well, logging, it's just the factory.
Right.
But in this case, our subscription manager is distinct from the factory.
Right. Okay.
So we needed something to activate it.
Okay.
This could be internals visible to none or all that other garbage. It only exists for activation.
Okay.
And in fact, isn't DI getting a feature for just activate this thing on startup?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anyone else does.
I think Sebastian's been working on it.
So you're asking whether DI has an auto start feature? I think so, yeah. That was one of the features from R9 that was requested, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gone through yet. But when does it start? On container build?
Yeah.
In this case, I don't know that we want it to start until the host actually starts.
I mean, I believe starting on container build is a fine time to start, but I won't claim to have fully thought through it.
Well, I'll see if that feature is even available. I couldn't find it last I looked.
Okay, but I guess from the API perspective, it's basically to say this is another internal plumbing API that we never expect any user to call, and it's just public because it has to be because of the details of crossing an assembly boundary.
All right.
So I just recorded this as a question then. I mean, that seems like something you want to probably resolve offline with iMetrics Subscription Manager. Right now, the odd thing is there's no consumer for this. Nobody exposes it, nobody takes it.
It's consumed in hosting privately.
Yeah, I'm just saying from an API standpoint, it's weird to have a type that is not produced by anything nor consumed by anyone. It just right now the API, there's just an interface floating around basically.
Yep.
And then there's a bunch of other things that are below that. So there was all of this stuff here. These guys here. Should we remove them next? Should we review them next time, or do we think we can do this in the last 4 minutes?
I mean, these are dirt simple, so maybe. But for reference, I haven't even tried to implement these yet.
Gotcha.
I actually scroll down. Let's look at the hosting ones really quickly, because those I have implemented, and those are very simple. Look, we get some new properties on existing types that just return us a builder that exposes extension methods. See above.
Yep, that makes sense to me.
All right. Well, then I think that's enough for now.
So is this we'll just come back and finish the last bits in a future session?
Yeah, I think so. I can just add this as unreviewed.
Specifically the config part and the console sync at the bottom.
Yeah.
The console sync isn't exactly one API, so, well, two.
Are we still doing Thursday sessions, Emo?
Yes, we are.
Or are you, Chris, this Thursday? I think you're out, right?
I'm out of town, but Noah, feel free to finish it up.
Okay.
I guess I mean, because we could do it next Tuesday. That's better. I guess my only thing is like we had ideally want this to have design reviewed or API reviewed by RC1.
Yeah.
So however we make it, whichever day we pick is fine. Just as long as we make it.
Yeah, we seem to have enough things left for Thursday, right? So like Thursday, either way, we can meet and then review the other things, and then we can do when Chris is back on Tuesday. I mean, presumably that's enough runway for you guys, right?
Okay.
I mean, by all means, get to this if you can, but I can understand wanting to get through the other stuff.
No, it's not about the other stuff. It's more like, you know, do we, like, if just Noah is here, do we get all the questions answered, or are we doing 2 sessions then anyway? In which case, you might as well defer to when you are back, right?
I haven't tried to implement them anyways, so I don't know that I could answer any of your questions.
So then it sounds like we should wait until Tuesday anyway.
Yeah, let's just wait until Tuesday.
Then let's do that. All right, then I think that's it for today. Thanks everyone, and sorry for everybody who did not get to their items. I did not know this would take the full 2 hours. As always.
Yeah. Yeah, you all can have Thursday. Thank you.
It's 2 hours and then some.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.